Hi, everyone. Welcome to Foresight's Intelligent Corporation Group. We have a really wonderful guest today that many of you already know, or whose work at least you already know. It's certainly come up a few times in previous seminars here in very different contexts. And I think that your talk title of today is really like a good hint for why that is, because you'll be talking about beneficial futures of pluralism. And you, is Danielle Elm from Harvard University. You've written, I think, far and wide across plenty of different fields. And so we're delighted to have you here and to perhaps have a bit of a broader discussion about how cooperation and cooperation technologies, including law, but also many others, can bring us beneficial futures defined by pluralism. So thank you so much for coming. We really cherish having you in our little container here. I'll be in the chat and I'll be monitoring questions. Yeah, and from now on, I would say the stage is yours. Please take it away. And I'll be monitoring the chat. Thank you so much for joining.
Sure. No, thank you so much, Allison. And good to have you all here. I'm glad to join your conversation. I am very interested and curious to learn more about the shape of your conversation and exactly what kinds of things you like to dig into. I am going to take the time to introduce myself a little bit, and then maybe some terms that are a bit more personal than maybe conventional, just so that you can know where I'm coming from as I talk to you today about beneficial futures from pluralism. So I will get to that precise theme, but let me just say, first, you can probably tell a little bit from what's being put in the chat. I am a combination of a Harvard prof and democracy advocate. And when people ask me what I work on, I just always give the same simple answer, just democracy, past, present, and future thereof. And for me, there's no question mark on the end of that. And the fact that there's no question mark there is really important. This is a commitment I come by super honestly. So it's just a matter of basic family inheritance. On my dad's side, my granddad helped found one of the first NAACP chapters in Northern Florida in the 40s. And Northern Florida is basically the same thing as Southern Georgia. And at that point of time in the 1940s, the lynchings were on the rise. So it was super dangerous work. He was taking his life in his hands to stand up for the notion that human thriving depends on empowerment, depends on access to core political rights. On my mom's side, my great-grandparents helped fight for women's right to vote in the early 20th century. So my great-granddad was what you could call an early ally. He marched with suffragettes on Boston Common in 1917. And my great-grandmother ended up as president of the League of Women Voters in Michigan in the 30s. So in addition to being both these lines of people were people who considered empowerment the bedrock for human well-being, there were also people who were often told that something was impossible, like social equality for African Americans in the South was impossible, or women having the right to vote was impossible. And their answer to these kinds of impossibilities was, oh, these things are not only possible, they're necessary. And so the only actual question is, how are we going to accomplish those forms of empowerment, securing those rights? So that's a spirit I bring to all my work. As a young person, I was lucky to grow up in a super civically engaged family, and they were engaged all over the political spectrum, the whole spread. And so I took the value of democracy for granted as a kid. It wasn't really until I was watching my own generation come up in the world that the question of democracy's value got a lot more complicated for me. So my parents' generation, everybody pretty much moved up. That same granddad was a fisherman, and then his kids were small business owners and professors. On the other side, it was from factory workers to accountants. But my generation has lived through something completely different. We've lived through what I call the great pulling apart. Here I sit, able to zoom in to you for wherever you are all over the world. You're on my desk here at Harvard, tenured faculty member at a great university. That's a position of immense privilege. I have a brother who's a corporate executive. And at the same time, I also have cousins, so age mates, people that I grew up with, people I used to run around in the streets playing football with, who they're not here anymore. And they're not here for some of the hardest things we struggle with in our society. So substance use disorder, incarceration, homicide. It was when I lost my youngest cousin, Michael, in 2009, that I had a real kind of life turning point moment, and just also a real sort of aha moment when I realized what my family was living through, where some of us were up here in rarefied and privileged space, and others were trapped in really dark and difficult circumstances. That's what the whole US, the whole United States, has lived through over the course of my lifetime. So my 50 plus years on the planet track the graphs that show you the rise of income inequality, the rise of wealth inequality, and the rise of polarization, and the rise of incarceration. So at that point in 2009, which is, of course, just not that long after the kind of basic invention of social media, et cetera, et cetera. So we didn't really understand that universe yet, its effects. So in 2009, I started to ask myself the question of how can we change the basic dynamics of how our democracy is functioning? Because at the end of the day, democracy is not supposed to be abstractly valuable. Like, yes, we love the ideals of freedom and equality, of pluralism and everything that pluralism brings in a plural society. Pluralism has always been a part of the definition of democracy. We love those things, but not just abstractly. The idea is that they actually deliver a society that makes it possible for every generation to do a bit better than the previous, for whole generational cohorts to move up together, and for people to experience genuine thriving along all dimensions: intellectual, cultural, economic, political. So it's a sort of big picture question of how you achieve that. But democracy is meant to be concretely valuable, not just abstractly valuable. So that sort of moment of recognition has taken me into a line of work that I call democracy renovation, where I really dig into the question of how can we change those dynamics. My first sort of area of effort was in the criminal justice space, where I tried to work on criminal justice reform. But I quickly learned that our various institutions for governance were just dysfunctional. Even where you had cross-partisan and common sense solutions, it was nearly impossible to get them through. And so I don't know how many of you would remember, or I'm not sure how many of you are US based versus elsewhere, but in 2013, US Congress had an approval rating of 13%. So we are back at a place where it is that bad, but it has actually been that bad for a decade. And so then that changed my focus from the kind of substantive area of policy to the just broad landscape of democracy renovation and this question of what would it take to have actually responsive institutions. Now, I say all that by way of preface because it really is the background to the question of what the stakes are for thinking about pluralism and for thinking about what colleagues like Glenn Weil and I call plural technologies, and an approach to technology development that goes under the framework of plurality. So this great pulling apart that my generation has lived through, people were starting to understand that it was coming into existence in the early 90s, about when I was graduating from college. So summer of 1992, I remember the politics of the year, that election season, everybody was debating this question. Was there growing income inequality? And if so, did it matter? So it was a surprisingly long debate, a surprisingly long amount of time that people spent working through this question of whether income and wealth inequality were genuinely rising in problematic ways. And of course, we know the answer. The answer was yes. In other words, I graduated into a society that was experiencing this great pulling apart because of the structure of how globalization was working its way through the economy, because of, I would say, technocracy and the way in which certain sort of top-down approaches to policymaking and cookie-cutter policymaking blueprints applied across context were undermining sort of the basis for social empowerment and social well-being in particular places. That was all that was coming into existence as I was graduating from college. So now here we find ourselves 30 or so years later with another massive social transformation underway from the impact of generative foundation models and technology more broadly, from social media until now. And in that moment, I think we really face the question of whether or not how tech development unfolds going forward, whether it continues to exacerbate that great pulling apart I described, or whether we could tap into it as the solution to that great pulling apart, whether we could actually draw on the affordances of technology to change the dynamics of the political economy so that people have the basis of material empowerment, so that we can put power back in the hands of individual people for shaping their own lives and solving problems of coordination. The question of whether or not we can undo the massive concentrations of power that have developed. So that's what brings me to plurality and the plurality framework that many of us are building. And when I say many of us are building this, here at Harvard, I run a research network called Getting Plurality, which is about governing emerging technology and technology for next generation governance in this paradigm of plurality. There's a Plurality Institute that is growing on the West Coast and in Taiwan in particular as well, a very large plurality community coming into existence. So what exactly are we working on? What is the potential of plurality and pluralism? So as you all know, in the world of development of AI, drawing on concepts related to space, time, and physics and the like, singularity has been a really important governing metaphor for how people have thought about their work. And of course, there's some technical meanings of singularity, but then in addition, there's a kind of broader metaphorical surround that has come to be attached with that concept. And that metaphorical surround has pointed people towards a kind of conception of a sort of singular intelligence that might exceed that sort of singularly conceived human intelligence. To develop that has required immense concentrations of capital and generated really also important forms of concentration of power in political terms, as that concentration of capital comes to intersect with concentration of influence over our political systems. And now, of course, with generative foundation models, there's the potential for a sort of very small number of people to make decisions that are broadly consequential for the globe as a whole without much in the way of broader political accountability. In a sense, what we're trying to do is juxtapose a very different model for thinking about technology, its potential, and how we can govern it in ways that support human flourishing. And the starting point for this is the sort of recognition that pluralism or plurality is a kind of concept that operates on multiple levels. For starters, it communicates a point about human cognition. Human intelligence is multiple. It comes in a diversity of forms. These forms cannot actually be resolved into some singular human intelligence. We get the best out of humanity, what humanity has to offer, if we can amplify the multiple kinds of intelligence that human beings have, activate them, and then, of course, supplement and augment them. And then the supplements and augments that may come from machines, they too can be multiple. It's not the case that every single kind of machine intelligence is of the same character or quality. So that's the first point, that intelligence is multiple or plural. The second point is that human societies are also pluralistic, and they are most, especially when freedom is protected. Freedom, by definition, supports the emergence of difference. James Madison made this point back in the Federalist Papers in the 1780s. And what people have come to understand over time is that difference as it emerges, again, intellectual difference, cultural difference, differences in forms of organization and social practices and the like, what that permits is this incredible epistemic power for humanity. In some sense, it's like taking the point about multiple intelligences up one level. The power of us to activate human pluralism for social benefit is really immense. An economic benefit that we can get from that, existential benefit that comes from the sort of diversity of cultural experiences that are possible for people, decision-making benefits that come from, again, a kind of diversity of perspectives being brought to bear on any particular problem. So pluralism offers us great possibility for human accomplishment, for supporting human flourishing. Of course, it comes with challenges. It is also the case that diversity and difference or pluralism can yield significant conflict within societies. In that regard, human pluralism, if one wants to activate it and support it, is something that one has to bring great intentionality to. One needs to design for organizations and laws and incentive structures that activate pluralism to achieve those epistemic benefits, those economic benefits, those cultural benefits, and those decision-making benefits. So then the third piece comes to the sort of political level. So we did the human cognition, social level, and then there's the political level. And there too, as you heard from my starting stories, as I said, I take the view that empowerment is the bedrock for human flourishing and well-being. This is a very basic picture of freedom. I told you the story of my grandparents and my great-grandparents to exemplify what the lived experience is for people who see empowerment as that bedrock, that my granddad was willing to take his life in his hands in order to try to achieve political equality, that my great-grandmother was willing to disregard all the scoffers who said that women voting would be impossible, and she made it happen. And the reason this is happening, the reason people do this, is because at the end of the day, human beings thrive most fully when they have full autonomy. Importantly, though, autonomy can never be just in the private realm. Freedom can never just be about our private choices. This is because we necessarily live in a world of shared constraints, norms, rules, laws, and those are all social creations. So if we human beings are going to have our full autonomy, we need to be the co-author of the restraints that actually affect our life in our public spaces and in our shared spaces. So human autonomy fully understood requires, yes, private liberties, but also public participation. Those two things go together. And the result of that recognition about human well-being is that democracy is the political form that best supports the full activation of human autonomy. So pluralism, in the sense, finally, of a politics full of differing voices, full of disagreement, yet empowering people and establishing decision-making structures that enable that pluralism to be converted into stable, durable, common good solutions at the end of policymaking processes. That's the sort of additional dimension of plurality or pluralism. Concentrations of power undermine that, all right? So that's one of the challenges we currently face. So given this picture of the value of pluralism at the cognitive level, at the social level, at the political level, then the question is, how can technology facilitate bringing out the value on all these dimensions? In our broad network, we talk about plural technologies. And these are technologies that are designed from these sets of starting points, these sets of preliminary commitments, and then seek precisely to do that work of affirming the multiplicity of intelligence, of augmenting intelligence, or of helping people coordinate across diversity and difference in social spaces in ways that come to better solutions for the common good, better solutions to public goods problems. And then finally, in the political space, there's the question of how do we design governance so that we can also achieve that full participation of voices, make conflict something that is turned into productive negotiation, yielding stable results. So having said all of that, let me turn now to some more specific places where I think that technology could make a very big difference. Some of these will be very familiar examples to you. There's some great examples of augmentation that you also recognize the multiplicity of intelligences. Zoom, which we're on right now, is one of those great examples. It doesn't replace anything that we human beings could otherwise do. So that is a terrific example of what we would call a kind of plural technology, because it starts from the notion that we can augment, not replace human intelligence. Or there is work by people like Luke Thorburn and Aviv Odavia on bridging algorithms and trying to make sure that social media can function in such a way as not to drive outrage, not to drive division, but actually to facilitate more productive connections and formation of community across digital space. There are lots of good specific examples out there. Or I'm sure you've often talked about Taiwan and Polis and the benefit of being able to do synthetic meaning making scale for solving public goods problems, resolving political conflict into stable policy outcomes. Those would be three terrific examples of plural technologies on our vocabulary. But I am going to just, from the last sort of stretch of my remarks, turn my attention to the question of democracy specifically, and some of the ways in which I think we could go about trying to, again, tap into the affordances of new technologies to give us much healthier, more resilient, more effective forms of governance. So let me also now share that a few years ago, I did the somewhat crazy thing of running for governor here in Massachusetts. And this was a good deal of fun. I enjoyed myself immensely. I learned a lot, got my clock cleaned as well, which was also a good thing. I did find from that experience of being on the campaign trail for 15 months that I just truly enjoyed being out and about in Massachusetts, visiting with people in very different kinds of communities, from rural to on the seaside to our various post-industrial gateway cities, as we call them, that are now have a high percentage of immigrants and so forth. A lot of diversity across Massachusetts. And in all of these communities, everybody is struggling to improve the tools they have for solving shared problems, to improve governance in effect. And what I started to see was a certain kind of pattern in the kinds of complaints that people have about governance as it currently operates. So just to give a few examples, in recent weeks, I was up on our North Shore here in Massachusetts for a sort of Saturday morning chit chat about city councilor candidates over donuts and the like. And there was one gentleman there who said, well, the worst thing is just the not knowing. It's just the not knowing, which is so terrible. And he continued, and he explained that what he was talking about was that things would happen in his town or his community, and he just would never even know that it was something that was being debated or was being considered. And so it's this sense of being buffeted by things that were beyond his control that was so immensely frustrating to him. And of course, he is tapping into something very real. Our world is increasingly complex, increasingly opaque. I think many people are living with a sort of terrible sense of just sort of the not knowing, the not understanding. And the point is, it's actually a burden. It's an existential burden for people. Another woman in Western Massachusetts, her point she wanted to make was nobody pays attention to us out here in Western Massachusetts. And she said, take, for example, the weatherman. Have you noticed every time the weatherman reads out the weather for Massachusetts, he stands in front of Western Massachusetts? So the map that he's showing the weather, he's standing in front of the very part of the state that she lived in. And for her, the complaint was fundamentally about not feeling seen, not feeling recognized by any of the kind of major systems or institutions that she felt herself to be depending on. Or in other communities, very specifically, people would spend a lot of time detailing concrete challenges that they had in their community, maybe about housing, maybe about insufficient beds for behavioral health crises at local hospitals, any number of things. They would also have very concrete solutions to these things to propose. But then if I asked them whether they were going to vote, the answer would be no, I'm not going to vote. And so that was a very powerful and alarming disconnect. They were involved, they were paying attention, they had ideas, but no, they weren't going to vote. And why not? No surprise to any of you, I'm sure their answer was, it doesn't matter. It makes no difference whatsoever if I vote. So lack of a sense of effectiveness. So lack of knowledge, lack of being recognized, lack of effectiveness. Those are the three experiences that form the core of our current way of relating to our representative institutions in a democracy. This is unstable. This explains, I think, a lot of the political turmoil that we see around us. Again, as our world complexifies, every single one of those things gets worse, right? So coming back to the great pulling apart, here we are, where we've had the great pulling apart from globalization for several decades. And now we are at a point where technology could exacerbate it or it could make it better. And I think that the way technology could help make it better would be if we really put our minds to designing improvements to our basic structures of democratic governance that responded to that problem of not knowing, that problem of not being seen, and that problem of not being effective. So one of the things we're doing right now in Massachusetts is we're mapping the sort of landscape of civic infrastructure to see all the degradation, all of the ways in which it's eroded over the last few decades. There are local news deserts all over the state. That contributes to the not knowing. It's a direct outgrowth, of course, of social media, the rise of social media. Because of the lack of local news deserts, there's a lack of public notice around all kinds of public functions. And so that means people can't even see the entry points for what are the levers they could pull. Where could they actually make a difference? And so we're seeing the sort of degree of effectiveness come down on that front. And then, of course, both of those things are connected to the lack of recognition. When people don't see things changing and don't see anybody recognizing their experience in how those things are changing, why those decisions are being made. And the great distance at which tech development occurs, I think, that contributes to that experience of a lack of recognition. So we're mapping within the institutions of the state the specific places where things have eroded and are now seeking to identify tools that can be embedded in the processes of our representative government to address those three kinds of experience. So to conclude, let me give a very concrete example. Here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, we have had a struggle for the last couple of years, a fight over between sort of bikers and residents. This will come as no surprise. This is a common conflict line right now. We have a beautiful road that kind of bans the city and it runs along the river called Memorial Drive. And when it is closed to traffic, it is a beautiful place for a great biking expedition. And during the pandemic, it was frequently closed. And so bikers began to think of this road as their own. They owned it. They could have these beautiful, long, gorgeous rides along the river whenever they wanted. But of course, the pandemic is over. And the effect of those road closures is to isolate, in particular, the historically African-American neighborhood in Cambridge, so that they cannot reach other roads when they need to leave their neighborhood when Memorial Drive is closed for bikers and cyclists. Now we are coming to a point where the city has to make a decision about precisely how to calibrate when the drive will be closed for bikers. And how do we go about doing this exactly? How can we make a decision? The aspiration is to build on things, examples like Taiwan or Polis or other kind of participatory tools and practices that are now embedding AI tools for sense making at scale to construct conversational contexts in which those challenges can be negotiated, where people can discover some common ground solutions that may not be visible right now as the fault lines are currently defined, and then to be able to provide advice to city council. And the good news is we have a charter review commission in the city that has just recommended that citizens' assemblies be added to the structure of our government. So this is a huge opportunity to really think through how plural technologies that are affirming the multiplicity of intelligences, providing recognition in that kind of way, that are helping people coordinate across difference and disagreement to activate pluralism for positive ends, and that then are contributing to the processes of democratic governance so people have that experience of efficacy and empowerment. To embed citizens' assemblies using the tools of technology is a real opportunity for us to try to improve, take representation to another level, figure out what it can look like in the 21st century to see if we can start reversing the dynamics on that great pulling apart. So I hope that concrete case gives you some clarity about what I see, again, as those positive potentials for pluralism linked up with technology development. And let me pause there. I think there have been some questions flowing into the chat, though I haven't been able to track them. So I'm happy to. So no, it's not the citizens' road to keep people out. The road gets closed so that bikers can use it. But the unintended consequence of that is that it basically segregates the neighborhood, blocks people from having access to other roads that they need.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Danielle. Yeah, from this time onward, if you guys want to make a comment, have a question, feel free to raise your hand if it's not already in the chat. For example, Nicholas, I don't know if you want to make that comment to Danielle. If so, feel free to just, I have a few of my own, but I want to give you guys the floor first before I chime in here.
Yeah, thank you, Allison. Yeah, Danielle, actually, we met at this Plurality research conference in Berkeley sometime last year, and I really appreciate your talk then. I really appreciate what you're doing. And yeah, I don't have much in the way of questions. I just have praise and enthusiasm because this movement really needs a voice like yours, bringing it forward. And the one thing that I'll add is just that with the Plurality Research Network, Goodly Labs is doing some work around online deliberation and governance. And Goodly Labs is also releasing this technology called Public Editor before the elections that allows society to do this collective sense making and really take on the big challenge of misinformation and disinformation, which is going to be flooding our discourse just like it did in the previous elections, maybe worse with AI now. And so that's just something for people who are really interested in this space and what's developing with plural technology. Those are some examples as well. And just a lot of appreciation to you and Glenn, Allison, and everyone in this movement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. Do you go by Nicholas or Nick? Who is it?
I tend to go by Brigham, actually.
Okay, Brigham.
My middle name. I was one of these people that during the pandemic got into my artistic side, working on poetry and music. And somehow I gravitated more to my middle name. I am in the middle of my life. Maybe it makes sense. So I answer to Nick or Nicholas, but Brigham or Brig that's the name lately.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. And I appreciate those words of affirmation. It's very nice to see how rapidly this community is growing. So I'm glad you're here again today. Thank you.
Well, next up, we have Alan, if you want to unmute.
Yeah, I was thinking about the problem of news deserts. In Palo Alto, we have 3 free newspapers, 2 weekly, 1 daily. One takes subscriptions, but the other 2 are fully ad supported. And I'm wondering if there's a way to bootstrap. Getting started seems to be the problem. But perhaps if there was a way to bootstrap that in small communities, they could become self-sustaining just from ads. And I get really local news, like the problem with the gerbil at the local middle school. This is really local news, and it's wonderful.
And those are all 3 are digital products, I take it?
No.
They're print. Huh. Interesting. Yeah, I would love to hear you say more about that. I think a lot of people, there are a lot of organizations that are trying to reinvent business models for journalism. For example, as I'm sure a lot of folks at this point are building philanthropic models for news organizations. ProPublica was the first one, but now there's like lots spreading around at a local level. But this feels like a kind of place where I'm not sure the kind of tech space has made as much contribution here as it could. It seems like there are probably solutions that are not visible to people who don't have the relevant expertise. I don't know if anybody else wants to weigh in on that subject, but I do think helping people bootstrap those local newspapers, regardless of whether print or digital, would be a valuable thing. And I don't know if this is a good opportunity or space to talk about quadratic funding. That seems like a potential piece that might support it. But there you go. Glenn said exactly the same thing at the same time. So Glenn, I'm curious, if you were trying to help folks get moving on quadratic funding models for local journalism, how would you go about doing that?
The simplest experiment would be for either a government, or in Europe, there's a lot of, and Asia, there's a ton of public funding for media, or philanthropists to basically hold an NPR style campaign for local journalism around the country, maybe even to deal with identity issues, do it the way that those campaigns usually run through phonathons, and then offer matching, but make the matching dynamic and have some of the usual affordances for showing how that works, maybe with some public access television interface to it, or now it would be cheaper to do it over YouTube. So I think the idea of doing some kind of engaging game show style, somewhat entertaining version of a NPR campaign, but for local media with support and matching funds from philanthropy. It's just not that different from the way that those things have worked in the past. So it would be familiar, but it would have a lot more democratic character to it than the current mechanism.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And in that regard as well, what we could and should be doing is, because there's actually a lot of bills in state legislatures right now that are exploring public funding for journalism. And they're all pretty conventional and recognizable. And it would be an interesting thing to see if there were a state legislature that was ready to go for a kind of like they could be the match in a kind of quadratic funding model.
Yeah. And a nice element of it, from my mind, is that there's a lot of people who are concerned about public funding for journalism for some very good democratic theory reasons. And many of those people tend to be slightly on the right end of the political spectrum. And many of those people are also very enthusiastic about quadratic funding. So in a purple state where there's some of those conflicts coming to the fore, this would be a natural possibility.
Yep. I think I'm going to make one of your autopilots out there is going to have to send me that particular note so I can follow up on it.
We have two in the game, so one of them will probably get to it. Ellen, you had another comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up that I think it's important that it only be public funding for bootstrap. One of the nice things about these free papers, one of them's a daily, is that they have a professional reporting staff. And you're not going to attract the best people if you're dependent on some sort of charity long term. These people view it as a career or as a step to a bigger paper. And so we get pretty good investigative reporting out of these people. And I don't know we would have if it depended on government grants.
I'm curious whether or not anything about the ad sales model has changed. That is, how have they managed to find a foothold in ads in
You'd have to contact the publisher, the Palo Alto Daily Post. You could probably find it and ask him how he did it. There was another one that was failing, and this guy picked it up. And it's now a decade or more that this paper has been completely free. Yeah. Sometimes you can't find it. The boxes where it's distributed are empty because people are reading it. You know, some magic there, but it's a model.
Yeah. No, super interesting. Thank you.
Cool. We have Wim also chiming in here.
Hi, Danielle. My name is Wim. I'm a graduate student. I'm a big fan of your work. You wrote in Justice by Means of Democracy, talked a bit about the inherent value of, being a co-author on the collective restraints that we agree to. And I wonder, it seems like the AI companies that are leading right now think about where they're headed in terms of, as you say, the governing metaphor of the singularity. And it seems like with respect to AI alignment, a lot of the approaches that they're taking to AI alignment, like aligning AI with human values, seem to follow from that metaphor. And I'm curious, about what you think about that. We talked about it earlier. Yeah, technocracy as a source of this coming, like the great coming apart. And I think, Glenn, you wrote in your essay about against technocracy about one instance of this being the Center for Nanotechnology. I think Joe Edelman right now is running the Meaning Alignment Institute, which won OpenAI's competition for democratic inputs into AI. And I think what they're doing is following this process where they are able to get people to connect with their personal, non-instrumental values. And then those values are being inputted into AI systems. But it seems then what happens is that people's values treated as an input into a system, and then that kind of gets atrophied over time if it isn't continually replenished to be actually representative of people's values at any given moment in time. And I wonder does that seem problematic? If so, are there alternatives? If why? If not, why?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. I think that it's really important that there be people who aren't just the sort of frontier AI firms in a position to be making meaningful advances around AI. And that's a very challenging thing because of the concentration of capital necessary for those advances. So it seems to me that it is in fact important that the public sector actually be an investor in areas of functionality for AI that you're less likely to get to if you have a profit motivation for the work. And then at the point of various technical breakthroughs, one would hope that there are pathways for scaling, some commercialization pathways, probably it's not only the public sector, that could then benefit from that public investment in kind of earlier layers of work to achieve outcomes that wouldn't necessarily, align exactly with the sort of more narrow alignment processes that you're getting from the frontier firms. So what I have in mind, for instance, is if you just think about biomedical space, right? And there's the now classic example of the public investment in things like research that led to the mRNA breakthroughs, which all of that research had been going on for years prior to the point in the pandemic when Moderna and Pfizer were suddenly able to commercialize and scale it up. And the relevant research breakthroughs, they didn't happen in the commercial space. It depended on that kind of public sector investment. So at any rate, I think there's probably room for improvement in terms of how the AI firms themselves are thinking about alignment to values. There's room for broadening the categories and improving those processes. And in addition, I think it's just really important that there be sufficient capacity in the public sector to lay down tracks for other directions of development so that we are not limited to what is driven by the for-profit sector. I hope that makes some sense. I'm curious what you think, actually, Wim. What do you think?
Yeah, sure. I think that makes sense. I think I have to think it through a little bit, but I wonder, it seems like you touched on two things there. There's room for AI companies to broaden the inputs that they get from actual people. And then there's also, accounting for that benefits that you can get from the public sector. But those seem to be different to me. So I guess one of the things that I'm struggling with is it seems like even when these companies are making these really intentional efforts to have their systems be modeled after the values of people, like in the Meaning Alignment Institute case, where they're going to people and they're having them ask questions to try and have them reveal their values. It seems like when you this is the kind of thing you only do once, and then you have you say, okay, great, these are the principles that we're going to use to try and align our AI systems. It seems like unless this is continually updated, then the AI systems that govern our world are aligned with the values that the people who were involved in this experiment had in 2023. And if these are the systems that we're using in 5 years, they're way more advanced. It just seems detached from popular will and people's values.
Yeah, I guess, same problem as you have with law, right? Like law generally faces the same issue. And it's tricky because it's not the case that the whole sort of fabric of law or the whole fabric of the kind of parameters that are established for models and the like, the fabric is not equally historical. So some things are more time bound than others. And the hard part is to try to figure out which are those things that are more time bound than others, which are the things that are going to be like in 10 years, not going to make any sense, versus which of the things are going to be more durable. And so in the legal realm, you see a kind of always debate about what are the things that rise to constitutional levels versus what are the things that are about ordinary legislation. And the constitutional things you expect to have supermajority decision rule around. Ordinary legislation, you have a majority decision-making rule around. So I think something similar could apply in this space as well, that there needs to be some work to actually determine which are the things that count as constitutional level choices, which are the things that count as legislative level choices, and you might have different decision-making rules for each as a part of developing legitimacy. But let me also go ahead and invite Glenn to weigh in here.
Well, just wanted to speak to one other side of your question, Mim, which is obviously part of this is public versus private sector, but another part is ideological. And I think the Edelman thing is, in my mind, an illustration of that. Just to be clear, he did not win that contest. He was one of 10 selected. So it's one approach. But Edelman's, I don't know if you're familiar with this, Danielle, but Edelman's project and that group's project involves this notion of like finding a true ultimate normative set of values that like nest everyone else's values that then can govern these AIs.
Yeah.
I think, not to say there isn't something to be said at that level of abstraction, but unless at the absolute core of the values derived there is pluralism and not taking that approach, it's going to fall into a pattern, which is a big part of the problem with the current AI thing of there's a God's eye answer for everyone on everything. And that's precisely what's wrong with these systems, is that they are too hegemonic.
Right.
And there are other approaches as well. Danielle was talking about citizen assemblies, which are exciting things to do, and they have a lot of value. But there's a certain imaginary of having a single global citizens assembly that will once and for all align AI, and then we're off to the races. And I think that's just like antithetical to pluralism.
Yeah.
And honestly, I even think that the whole framing of alignment is extremely problematic for pluralism. The whole alignment conversation originally came from a cybernetic argument that Norbert Wiener made. And cybernetics is about feedback. It's not about alignment. It's not about you get a system to be the right system and then you just let it do whatever it's going to do. It's about multiple diverse forms of feedback. And I think a lot of these things are conceptual a bit off.
Yeah, love that comment. And maybe we can get back to that in a second. I just want to make sure that also, David, if you want to make your point about talent and so forth here in the chat or in the actual discussion, I think that could be a useful just like tidbit to also digest here.
Sure. Yeah, I think that I think it actually relates to something Glenn just said, but the comment was made earlier that there's a capital concentration that makes it hard to compete in AI. And I think that's partially true, but as we keep seeing happen, capital follows talent. People start companies and money is, if not poured on them, thrown at them. If you have the right people together, then the advances are possible and the money to make those advances happen are possible. I think that the reason why I think this relates to what Glenn said is fundamentally the concentration that happens here is fundamental to the idea of making very powerful systems. If you are trying to make very powerful, very intelligent systems, it's definitionally concentrated. And I think that putting lots of smart people together to make the systems, regardless of where they are or how they're funded, is still pushing in the same direction.
No, thank you for those thoughts. I don't think I have anything to add to them. Appreciate that perspective.
Ben, in case you want to respond to that, it's up to you. Okay. I think I had a question of what do you think? We already touched on a few examples, but we touched on a few specific tools that we can basically use to like better cooperate with each other in a pluralistic manner, like as humans. And where do you see like possible differences or where do you see possible parallels as we approach into a world where AI is more and more infused into these institutions to which we cooperate? So do you think that we just should do more of the same, or do you think that something will fundamentally change here? We need to update some of our phrasing or settings for those.
So that's interesting. And I'm gonna narrow your question to the very specific case of representative institutions of a democracy, just for the sake of having a kind of bounded target of inquiry. And I do think that we will experience representation quite differently by 30 years from now than we currently do. And I'm not sure exactly what the whole host of changes will look like. But I think what I'm trying to articulate, which I'm still not articulating super well, I'm still thinking my way through to the right articulation of it, is representation is about a set of core functions. I think I named 3 of them, which is not all of them, but the sort of point about knowledge, the point about being recognized, and the point about feeling effective. Representation achieves all 3 of those things. And currently, the bricks and mortar institutions that we developed for that aren't delivering any of that, or I shouldn't say none, but they're not delivering it very well. And so as we find fixes for those failures, drawing on the affordances of tech, we're going to start seeing a kind of coalescence of an alternative architecture. My instinct, and people differ on this one, Glenn and I argue about this actually. So my instinct is that the shape of the new construction is going to grow out of the hulk of the old one. And then there are other people who just think it's going to grow in a next door. It's going to grow someplace else. And then we're just going to move from one place to the next. So you have a broken down building. It's it's been abandoned for a while. It's decrepit. And then does a new thing grow out from inside of that hulk? Or do you just move a few blocks down and build something over here? I'm operating on the growing it up inside the kind of decrepit hulk thing. But others have a different view. That's a sort of odd answer to your question, Allison. I hope it connected.
Yeah. And I think that Glenn's also voicing that he generally agrees with you on that one, I think.
Okay. All right. Okay.
How about next one? We have Micah and Peter in the queue. And maybe I'm sure we can get to both of your points actually in the last 7 minutes. Or at least we can try it. Micah.
We could take both of them. How about? And then I'll just respond to
Yeah. Let's do that. Micah, then Peter, and then you can maybe close out with some closing words. Wonderful. Micah, you go.
So I agree with pretty much everything you said in your presentation, except for one part, which I think is also the core of your argument, which is that democracy is the solution to all of this. I'm a big fan of plurality and everything. My concern is, how do you avoid the tyranny of the majority, right? And which is the well-known problem with democracy. Oftentimes you have large groups of people that are very wrong, and we've seen this throughout history. How do we make democracy work or achieve plurality in some way that doesn't just devolve into some 51% majority making decisions for everybody else?
Yep.
Cool. Peter, you go. There
we go. So I think you have done a good job of articulating, so don't put yourself down too far for that. And I agree with you that there's this issue of what model are we going to take? How are we going to get to the nice new shiny building? I read Jen Paulka's Recoding America, and I feel like we're stuck in a building that's burning and all the doors are locked and there's no possible way out. That we built the system, that we've intentionally made it hard to change, and now it's too hard to change. And I see other countries that are managing this much better, right? So we haven't had a constitutional amendment in a long time. Finland manages to get a couple a year because their constitution was maybe Constitution 2.0 and it's easier to change. Feels like we're stuck. I'm glad that you're hopeful, but I see a lot of barriers.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Peter. Thanks. So those are both great questions. On the first one about majoritarianism, so it's important that democracy is not actually majority rule. Majority rule is just one decision-making rule among many that democracies can make use of, right? So sometimes you've got supermajority rule, you might use lottery. So in other words, a democracy consists of like the use of a whole set of tools. Then the question is, to what end? From my point of view, to the end of power sharing power so that everybody does have that experience of empowerment and efficacy and recognition and the like. That does mean tracking potential emergence of domination. That sort of would be the bad majoritarianism that you're describing, and being ready to correct it or mitigate it. So democracy, in my view, is a dynamic system, and it's a system that is always about figuring out what combination of tools do you need in order to keep power sharing activated so that you're supporting and enabling pluralism. That's not to say that the problem of majorities doesn't exist. It's a real problem, but I would say that's one of the points of democracy the constructor conceived, is that it's actually always undoing the problem of the tyranny of the majority. Now, the challenge in all of that is if you've got so many kind of countervailing ways of countering power and so forth, where do you get stability and legitimacy? And that's where you are trying to support development of incentive structures that are going to lead towards common good solutions. And I think, to put it very crudely or roughly, you could describe common good solutions as solutions that more often than not are going to get to more of a supermajority level of support, not a bare majority of support, but there's a lot longer conversation to be had on that subject. But the really important thing is, no, thank you, Micah, just that the majority rule piece is just one tool in the toolbox. And so, Peter, and to your point, the joke goes the other way around. Like, we have so many kind of countervailing powers in the U.S. system that we're stuck and we can't move at all. And that's partly what you're saying. We have other problems that have paralyzed us. So this is a place where it's true that when I look around and figure out where we can make changes, there's just this incredible architecture all over the country, all over the landscape of the US, which is our decision-making infrastructure. And it's represented by the building of the Capitol in DC and every single state house, but it's also represented by voting booths and by those spaces that I mentioned where the people are having the meeting over donuts about city council and the like. And if you consider that entire landscape, there are points that are open for change. So it's not, the whole system is not actually as rigid as the building in the Capitol and everything that's happening there is. And so that is a place where I do think if we target change in other places, so state level, and really focus on state level, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And I think if we could get the right kinds of things happening in about 10 states in the US, we would actually change our federal dynamics. So it's true that our change path is harder than a Denmark or a Finland or something like that. And that is the affliction, I think, of our particular history. But I do think we have a path. That's what I would want to say.
Oh, that you're ending on this. Oh yeah, go for it, Peter.
For the comments.
And I think
let's end on this optimistic note. That's, I think, a nice one to close it out. Thank you so much for coming and for sharing. I think, such a breadth and depth of, I think, knowledge from everything from our current institutions, how we cooperate, how we could cooperate better, how we could cooperate better through AI systems, with AI systems, and ultimately how AI systems, I think, can also relate to themselves in a more pluralistic manner. Is there anything you want to say in the last minute about what's new for you and how you're looking to collaborate with folks, or how people can find more about your work? Anything you want to share in the last words? That'd be great.
No, I appreciate that, Allison. Thank you. As I said, and Brigham, this might relate to your work. We are working on figuring out the concrete choices we're going to make here in Cambridge to try to help Cambridge be a model. So there may be some opportunities for collaboration there or with anybody else. So do please feel free to reach out to me. I will stick my email in the chat so that you can find me. But it would be great to be in conversation or in collaboration with all of you. So
awesome. I love that you're starting super pragmatic. You're just like, okay, let's clean up our own house first. Thank you so much for joining. It was a real pleasure. We've been waiting quite some time to finally have you on. Thanks for all your patience and your flexibility. Thank you, everyone, for joining. It was a really wonderful chat. And thanks a lot for joining. I hope it wasn't the last time. Thanks, everyone.